For 20 years, Samuel felt trapped in a toxic, loveless marriage to his wife, Eleanor. One morning, during another bitter fight, he decides he's had enough. He told a lie to end his 20-year marriage, thinking it would set him free. She was a wife he saw as a warden in the prison of his marriage. Instead, the scalding coffee she threw was just the beginning of his nightmare. A man says 2 words to shatter his wife's heart. There's another. Her reaction is violent, but what happens next is far worse. Dear friends, your comments and support mean the world to us. Tell us, what challenges have you faced in life, or maybe you're facing right now? Like this video and write where you're watching us from. We will be happy to send you our regards. So, stay with us. Don't miss what's coming next. The kitchen air was thick, heavy with the scent of dark roast coffee and 20 years of unspoken words. It was a smell I knew better than my own skin. The aroma of our shared decay. Eleanor sat across from me at the old oak table, her floral robe pulled tight around her, a fortress against the morning chill, and, I suppose, against me. Her hands, usually so expressive, were clamped around a ceramic mug as if it were the only solid thing in a world tilting off its axis. We were in our late 50s, a time when couples are supposed to be reaping the rewards of a long journey together. Quiet mornings, shared glances of understanding. For us, the silence was just a pause between battles. The yellow overhead light cast long, weary shadows on her face, carving new lines of bitterness around her mouth. I watched her, this woman who was my wife, and saw only a stranger whose geography I had long forgotten. Every word she spoke was a stone, and I had been worn down to a nub. Ungrateful, she'd hissed just moments before, the word slithering into the air. Selfish. You drift through this house like a ghost, except ghosts don't leave dirty dishes. I let the accusation hang there, another thread in the suffocating tapestry of our marriage. What was the point in defending myself? The war had been lost years ago. Now we were just picking through the rubble. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 1,000 times, on long drives home from a job I hated, in the dead of night when sleep offered no escape. But the words always felt like swallowing glass. Yet, something was different this morning. Maybe it was the way the weak sunlight struggled through the greasy kitchen window, or the relentless ticking of the clock on the wall, each second a reminder of a life slipping away. A profound exhaustion settled deep in my marrow, a weariness so complete it felt like a premonition of death. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that if I didn't break free now, I would die at this table, drowned in the dregs of lukewarm coffee and resentment. If you could have seen the future, seen the dominoes that were about to fall, you might have screamed at me to stop. But all I could see was the prison of my present. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, I met her gaze. Her eyes, once a warm, welcoming brown, were now hard, opaque stones. Eleanor, I began, my voice a dry rustle. This isn't working. It hasn't been working for a long, long time. A humorless laugh escaped her lips. Oh, it's not working for you. After I dedicated my life to this family. To you? You think marriage is a walk in the park, Samuel? It's work. It's sacrifice. Something you know nothing about. Each word was a familiar blow, a well-aimed strike at my manhood, my worth. And in that moment, the carefully constructed dam of my patience finally broke. The truth, I thought, wasn't enough. The truth was that we had simply withered, 2 plants in the same pot, starved of light and water. The truth was too quiet, too sad. It wouldn't be enough to sever the chains. I needed something loud, something brutal, a lie that would act like an axe. "There's someone else," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I'm in love with another woman." It was a lie, a desperate, clumsy fabrication born of cowardice. There was no other woman. My only mistress was the profound, aching loneliness that shared my bed each night. But the lie had a life of its own. I saw it hit her, saw the impact ripple across her face. First, a flicker of disbelief, her eyes widening as they searched mine for a sign, a tell. Then, as my silence confirmed the lie, the disbelief curdled into a fury so pure and raw it was almost beautiful. It was the most alive I'd seen her in a decade. It was as if I had poured gasoline on a dying ember, and the resulting inferno was magnificent and terrifying. Do you know what happens when a person's deepest fear is confirmed? They don't just break. They shatter into a million pieces, and every single one is a razor's edge. The world seemed to slow down, narrowing to the space between us. I saw the muscles in her jaw tighten, the knuckles on her mug turn white. The air crackled, charged with the energy of an impending storm. Her breath hitched, a ragged, ugly sound in the quiet kitchen. And then, with a speed that defied her age and weariness, she moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a primal reaction, an explosion of 20 years of suppressed rage, disappointment, and a love so twisted it had become indistinguishable from hate. The mug rose, a dark projectile against the yellow light. I saw the black liquid arc through the air, a steaming, glistening wave of her pain. And then it hit me. The pain was a sudden, blinding shock, a searing, electric heat that felt like it was peeling the skin from my face. I cried out, a strangled gasp, stumbling backward from the table, my chair screeching against the linoleum. The coffee dripped from my chin, my cheek, my eyelids, each drop a separate point of agony. Through the shimmering haze of pain, I saw her standing there, her arm still outstretched, her hand trembling. The mug lay shattered on the floor, a casualty in a war that had just escalated beyond all imagination. Her chest was heaving, her breath coming in short, sharp pants, and her eyes were filled with a terrifying cocktail of triumph and horror. "Another woman?" she screamed, her voice cracking, splintering the air. "After everything? After I gave you my youth, my body, my soul? You dare bring another woman into this house, into my life?" I grabbed a dish towel from the counter, pressing it to my burning face, the rough fabric a weak shield against the fire. The physical pain was immense, but it was nothing compared to the cold dread that was beginning to seep into my bones. What had I done? This lie was not an axe, it was a bomb, and we were both standing at ground zero. "We have no life," I shot back, my voice raw, the words tearing through the pain that was radiating across my cheek. "We have an arrangement, a habit. This house isn't a home, Eleanor. It's a museum of our failures." I lowered the towel for a moment, needing to see her, needing her to see the damage, not just on my skin, but the deeper corrosion my lie had finally exposed. The skin on my cheek was already an angry, blistering red, but the real wound was in the space between us, a chasm that had just opened up into the very depths of hell. Her fury seemed to falter, replaced by a frightening emptiness. The fire in her eyes didn't die down. It collapsed inward, leaving behind 2 black holes of despair. She looked at the shattered mug on the floor, then at her own trembling hands, as if they belonged to someone else. What happens when the rage that has fueled you for years suddenly runs out? You're left with nothing but the wreckage, and the chilling realization that you're the one holding the match. She sank back into her chair, a puppet with its strings cut. The floral robe, once her armor, now looked like a shroud. 22 years, she whispered, the words barely audible, directed at the floor, at the ghost of our marriage. I was a girl when I met you, Samuel. A girl with dreams. I wanted to be a teacher. I had a scholarship to Howard. I knew this story. I had heard it 1,000 times, usually at the peak of our worst arguments. It was her favorite weapon, the ghost of the life she'd sacrificed for me, for our son, Marcus, who was long grown and gone, wise enough to put 1,000 miles between himself and this house. But hearing it now, in the wake of such violence, the words had a different weight. They weren't just an accusation. They were a eulogy for the woman she might have been if she had never met me. Was I the sole architect of her unhappiness? No, that was too simple. We had built this prison together, brick by painstaking brick. Her bitterness was the mortar, and my silence was the stone. I leaned against the counter, the cool tile a small comfort against the throbbing heat in my face. My mind, reeling from the shock, began to drift back. I remembered our beginning, the impossible, intoxicating hope of it. I was a young mechanic with grease under my nails and a fire in my belly. She was the smart, beautiful girl who saw something in me no one else did. Our first years were a blur of ambition and passion, of building a life from scratch. We bought this house, this tiny 2-bedroom bungalow, and it felt like a palace. We painted the walls, planted a garden, we made a son. But somewhere along the way, the foundation cracked. The pressures of life, a mortgage that was always a day away from default, the constant worry about putting food on the table, the slow, grinding death of our individual dreams, began to eat away at us. My fire cooled to embers, and her dreams curdled into resentment. Have you ever watched something beautiful die so slowly you don't even notice until it's gone? That was us. Our love didn't end in a fiery crash. It starved to death in the silence of this very kitchen. You think I wanted this? She continued, her voice gaining a sliver of its old steely strength. To spend my best years scrubbing floors and worrying about bills while you came home smelling of oil and indifference? I gave you everything, and you just took. There it was again. The narrative she had perfected over 2 decades. She was the martyr, and I was the thief who had stolen her life. It was a story that absolved her of any responsibility for her own unhappiness, for her own choices, and for years I had let her tell it, partly out of guilt, and partly because fighting it was just too exhausting. But the lie about another woman had changed the dynamic. It had made me the villain in a way I had never been before. I wasn't just neglectful anymore. I was a traitor. I finally found my voice again, the words scraping my throat. And what did you give me, Eleanor? What did you give me besides criticism and contempt? When was the last time you asked me about my day and actually listened to the answer? When was the last time you touched me with anything other than anger? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, because we both knew the answers. The intimacy between us had vanished years ago, replaced by a cold, resentful truce. We were roommates bound by a legal document and a shared history that felt more like a sentence than a bond. I realized then that my lie wasn't just a tool to escape. It was a cry for help, a desperate attempt to be seen, even if it was as a monster, because being a monster was better than being invisible. It's a strange thing, isn't it? The lengths a man will go to, not for love, but just to feel that he exists, that his presence on this earth makes some kind of impact, even a destructive one. I looked at the coffee staining the linoleum floor, a dark, ugly Rorschach test of our marriage. It was a mess, a permanent stain that would never quite come out, no matter how hard you scrubbed. Just like us. The silence that answered my questions was more profound than any argument. It was a vacuum, pulling all the heat and noise out of the room, leaving only a cold, hard truth. We had nothing left to say to each other. We had exhausted our arsenal of blame and bitterness. I looked at her, truly looked at her, past the anger and the years of disappointment. I saw the girl she used to be, a flicker of the light that had once drawn me in, now almost entirely extinguished. And I saw myself, a man stooped by the weight of a life half-lived, his face scalded by a lie he told, because he was too much of a coward to speak a simple, painful truth. I am not happy. Are you? It was a question we should have asked each other a decade ago. Now, it was pointless. The patient was already dead. We were just arguing over the cause of death. I knew then, with a finality that settled like a stone in my gut, that this was the end. Not just of the fight, but of everything. "I'm done, Eleanor," I said, and the words were quiet, devoid of anger. They were just a statement of fact, like saying the sky is blue or the grass is green. I can't do this anymore. We can't do this anymore. We are poisoning each other, day by day. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, each step feeling both heavy and light. The linoleum was cool under my socks, a stark contrast to the fire still raging on my cheek. In the hall, just by the front door, was a duffel bag. It had been packed for a month, a silent testament to how long this departure had been brewing in my soul. It was filled with the essentials, a few changes of clothes, my toothbrush, the worn paperback I'd been reading to quiet my mind at night. Seeing it there, waiting for me, solidified my resolve. This wasn't a rash decision made in the heat of battle. It was a long overdue escape. How many nights had I stood in this very spot, my hand on the doorknob, only to retreat back into the quiet misery of my life? But the burn on my face was a brand, a physical reminder of the cost of staying. I slung the bag over my shoulder, the strap digging into my skin. I took one last look around the living room, at the faded armchair where I sat every evening, at the photographs on the mantelpiece, our wedding, Marcus as a baby, a family vacation to the Grand Canyon 10 years ago where we had smiled for the camera, perfecting the art of pretending. These objects weren't memories. They were artifacts from another life, a life that belonged to two other people I no longer recognized. A wave of sorrow, sharp and unexpected, washed over me. Not for the marriage I was leaving, but for the one that might have been. The one that had died so long ago we'd forgotten to bury it. What do you do with the grief for something you've already lost? You carry it. You pack it in a bag and take it with you. I glanced back toward the kitchen. Eleanor hadn't moved. She was a statue carved from regret, her silhouette framed by the harsh yellow light. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was just sitting there, staring into the abyss that had opened up between us at the coffee stain on the floor. That utter stillness was more terrifying than her rage. It was the calm at the eye of the hurricane, a quiet so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the other side of the storm to hit. It was the silence of a final, irreversible ending. I pulled open the front door, and the cool night air rushed in, a welcome shock to my system. It smelled of damp earth and freedom, a scent both intoxicating and terrifying. For a moment, I hesitated. A voice, small and treacherous, whispered in my mind, "Go back. Apologize. Stay." But then I touched my cheek, the skin tender and hot, and I knew there was nothing to go back to. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me. The click of the latch was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The night enveloped me. I walked down the cracked concrete path, the house shrinking behind me, its windows like vacant eyes. I got in my old Ford pickup, the engine turning over with the familiar, comforting rumble. Driving away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't dare. I thought that was it. I thought the worst was over. I spent the night at a cheap motel on the edge of town, the burn on my face a constant, throbbing companion. When I woke the next morning to the gray, unforgiving light, I felt a hollow sense of victory. I had done it. I was free. I looked at my reflection in the tarnished mirror above the sink. A stranger with a tired face and a red, angry welt on his cheek stared back. Then, my phone rang, its shrill cry cutting through the silence. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered, my voice thick with sleep. "Is this Samuel Miller?" a calm, professional voice asked. "Yes," I said. "Mr. Miller, I'm calling from Mercy Hospital. Your wife, Eleanor Miller, was admitted early this morning." The world tilted, the cheap motel room dissolving into a blur. I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles turning white. What? What happened? There was a slight pause on the other end of the line, a hesitation that sent a spear of ice through my heart. "She had a massive heart attack, Mr. Miller. She's in critical condition." Critical condition. The two words slammed into me, sucking the air from the cheap motel room. The professional voice on the phone was gone, but the sentence remained, echoing in the space where my thoughts used to be. My legs gave out, and I sank onto the edge of the lumpy mattress, the receiver still pressed to my ear as if it might offer more information, an absolution, a retraction. But there was only the dead hum of the dial tone. Outside, the morning traffic began its daily drone, a world moving on, oblivious. My world had just ground to a violent screeching halt. The burn on my cheek, which had been a dull, throbbing reminder of my freedom, now flared with a new kind of pain. It was no longer a wound of battle, but the brand of a coward, the mark of a man whose final act in a 20-year war was to drop a bomb and then discover his own soul was chained to ground zero. I don't remember the drive to the hospital. It was a blur of traffic lights and street signs that meant nothing to me. My mind was a frantic projector, replaying the scene in the kitchen over and over, but now with a horrific new filter. Every frame was soaked in guilt. The lie, "I'm in love with another woman," wasn't just an axe anymore. It was the precise, clinical jab of a needle, delivering a poison straight to her heart. Her scream, the shatter of the mug, the hot spray of coffee, it all replayed not as her rage, but as her breaking. The final, desperate lashing out of a soul I had just murdered with 4 simple, untrue words. Had her heart, already weakened by years of quiet disappointment and simmering anger, simply given up? It's a terrifying thought, isn't it? That words can have physical weight, that a lie can land with the force of a physical blow, capable of stopping a heart. The hospital was a maze of sterile white hallways and the medicinal smell of antiseptic that failed to cover the underlying scent of fear. Mercy Hospital. The irony was a bitter pill in the back of my throat. I found the cardiac intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. The waiting room was a small, purgatorial space with uncomfortable chairs and old magazines no one read. A young couple sat huddled in one corner, weeping silently. In another, an old man stared at the wall, his face a mask of stoic grief. I didn't belong here. I wasn't the worried husband rushing to his beloved's side. I was the cause, the perpetrator, walking into the scene of the crime. Every sympathetic glance from a passing nurse felt like a judgment. I walked to the reception desk, my movements stiff, robotic. "I'm here to see Eleanor Miller," I said, my voice sounding distant, like it was coming from someone else. The nurse, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, typed the name into her computer. "She's just been settled in. The doctor will be out to speak with you shortly. Please, take a seat, take a seat." As if I could. I paced the small room like a caged animal, the linoleum floor cool and indifferent beneath my worn boots. My duffel bag, the symbol of my new life, was still in the truck. A new life. What a joke. My new life was this room. This waiting, this crushing, suffocating guilt. The lie had been meant to sever a cord, to set me free from the past. Instead, it had become an anchor, dragging me down into a depth of responsibility I had never imagined. The doctor who eventually emerged was a young man, his face etched with a professional seriousness that did little to hide his own exhaustion. He looked at me, his eyes quickly scanning my face, and I saw a flicker of something. Curiosity? Pity? As he took in the angry red burn on my cheek. He didn't ask, but I knew he was wondering. And in his silence, I heard an unspoken question that would haunt me for the rest of my days. "What did you do to her?" "Mr. Miller, I'm Dr. Ramirez." His voice was calm, measured, a stark contrast to the chaos spiraling inside me. He led me to a small private consultation room, the door closing behind us with a soft click that sounded like a cell door locking. "Your wife has suffered a significant myocardial infarction. In layman's terms, a major heart attack. The primary artery to her heart was almost completely blocked. We've managed to insert a stent to open it up, but the damage to the heart muscle is considerable. She's stable for now, but she's not out of the woods. The next 24 hours are critical." He spoke with a detached clarity that was both comforting and terrifying. He was a mechanic, explaining what was broken in the engine. But the engine was my wife's life, and I was the one who had thrown sugar in the gas tank. He sat down opposite me, folding his hands on the small table between us. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, were fixed on me. "I need to ask you a few questions about Eleanor's recent history. Has she been under any unusual stress lately?" The question was a scalpel, expertly probing the wound of my guilt. Unusual stress? I almost laughed, a hysterical bark of a sound that I barely managed to swallow. Our entire life was unusual stress. "No more than usual," I lied, the words feeling thick and clumsy in my mouth. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic Morse code of deceit. I was certain he could see right through me, that my lie was as visible as the burn on my face. "Any recent shocks to her system? An argument? Frightening news?" He pressed on, his professional gaze unwavering. Was this standard procedure, or was he a detective slowly piecing together the crime? "No," I said, the word coming out as a croak. "Nothing I can think of." It was just a normal morning. The lie was getting bigger, heavier. It was a living thing now, a creature I had to feed and protect. A normal morning. A kitchen filled with rage, a shattered mug, a face scalded with coffee. Normal. Dr. Ramirez made a note on his chart, his expression unreadable. And her medical history? Any previous heart conditions? High blood pressure? I had to rack my brain, realizing with a fresh wave of shame how little attention I'd paid. Her pressure was up a bit at her last checkup, I think, I mumbled, feeling like the worst husband on the planet. She was supposed to be watching her salt. He nodded slowly, the silence in the room amplifying the frantic beating of my own heart. I felt stripped bare, my 20-year history of neglect laid out on the table for this stranger to inspect. Every word I spoke to my son felt like another stone being laid, building a wall around my terrible secret. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I wasn't walling the world out. I was walling myself in. He finally stood up, signaling the end of the interrogation. "We're doing everything we can. You can see her in a little while, but only for a few minutes. She needs to rest." He left me alone in that small, sterile room, and the silence was deafening. I had to call Marcus, our son. He was a grown man now, a successful architect living in Chicago, a world away from our suffocating little house. He'd escaped, but now I had to pull him back in. I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling so badly I could barely dial his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice bright and clear. "Hey, Dad." "What's up? Everything okay?" "No, son. Nothing is okay. I might have just killed your mother." The thought was so loud, so clear, I was terrified I'd said it out loud. "Marcus," I began, my voice cracking. "It's your mom. She's in the hospital." The silence on the other end of the line was a punch to the gut. I could hear his cheerful morning crumbling into dust. "What? What happened? Is she okay?" His voice was sharp with panic. "She had a heart attack, son." I relayed the doctor's clinical explanation, omitting the part where her heart attack had been preceded by my catastrophic lie. "Oh my God," he whispered, the sound raw with shock. "How? When? Did you have a fight?" The question I had been dreading, the question that cut right to the heart of the matter. My son knew us. He knew our patterns, our poisons. "No," I lied, and this lie was the most painful of all, a betrayal of the one person in the world I had tried to do right by. "No, son. It happened. It was so sudden." I could hear him breathing on the other end, trying to process it. I knew he didn't fully believe me, but he didn't press. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice now firm, resolute. "I'll book the first flight out. I should be there by tonight." We said our goodbyes and I hung up, the phone feeling like a 50-pound weight in my hand. I had survived. I had maintained the lie. But the relief I expected didn't come. There was only a cold, hollow emptiness. Now, I didn't just have to face my wife in that hospital bed. I had to face my son. And I had to do it while wearing a mask that was getting heavier with every breath I took. After what felt like an eternity, the kind-faced nurse from the front desk appeared at the door of the consultation room. "Mr. Miller? You can see her now. But please, just for a few minutes. She needs absolute quiet." I followed her out of the room and down another sterile corridor, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. The doors to the cardiac ICU swished open, and the air inside was different, colder, heavier, and filled with a low, rhythmic symphony of beeps, whirs, and soft hisses from the array of medical equipment. It was the sound of life being meticulously, artificially sustained. Each beep from the monitors was a metronome, counting out the seconds of a life held in a fragile, technological balance. There were other patients in the glass-walled rooms, still figures under thin white blankets, but I only had eyes for the room the nurse was leading me to. Room 304. My heart felt like a stone in my chest, heavy and cold. The man who had walked out of his house this morning, high on a desperate, hollow sense of freedom, was gone. In his place was a man walking toward a reckoning, a judgment rendered not by a robed figure, but by the steady, electronic pulse of a machine. The nurse paused at the door. "She won't be able to speak to you. She's heavily sedated. Just your presence might be a comfort." A comfort. The word was a cruel joke. My presence was the storm that had put her here. I nodded, unable to form words, and stepped into the room. And then I saw her. The sight of Eleanor in that bed was a physical blow. It knocked the air from my lungs and sent a tremor through my entire body. This was not the woman who had screamed at me, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. This was not the formidable, indomitable force who had been my adversary for 2 decades. The woman in the bed was a stranger, made small and terribly fragile by the machinery that surrounded her. Her face, usually so expressive and animated by anger or disappointment, was slack, pale, and eerily still. An oxygen tube was clipped to her nostrils, and an IV line snaked into the back of her hand, methodically dripping clear fluid into her veins. Wires snaked from beneath her gown to a monitor beside the bed, where a green line jaggedly traced the frantic, unsteady rhythm of her heart. I moved closer, my boots silent on the polished floor. I stood by her bedside and looked down at her face. Her eyes were closed. Her brow, which was so often furrowed in a frown, was smooth. She looked peaceful, but it was the peace of surrender, not of contentment. It was the terrifying stillness of a battlefield after the fighting is over. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the oxygen and the relentless, accusatory beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. Each sound drilled into my skull, a confirmation of my sin. The jagged green line on the screen was a visual representation of the damage I had caused. I had wanted to break her heart with words, and I had succeeded in the most literal, catastrophic way imaginable. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over me. I gripped the cold metal bedrail to steady myself, my knuckles white. The burn on my face throbbed in perfect time with the monitor, a hot, searing pulse of guilt. It was my scarlet letter, a brand that marked me as the author of this tragedy. All the anger, all the years of resentment I had harbored, evaporated in the cold, sterile air of that room. What was left was a profound, aching sorrow. I saw not the warden of my prison, but the girl I had fallen in love with, the young woman who used to laugh so easily, her head thrown back in genuine joy. Where had that woman gone? I had blamed her for changing, for becoming hard and bitter. But looking at her now, so vulnerable and helpless, I was forced to ask the question I had avoided for 20 years. What was my role in extinguishing that light? Marriage is a long, slow dance, and it takes 2 people to turn it into a funeral march. I had been so focused on my own unhappiness, my own feeling of being trapped, that I had refused to see hers. I saw only her anger, not the deep well of pain from which it sprang. As I stood there, watching the fragile rise and fall of her chest, a memory surfaced, unbidden. It was from years ago. Marcus was maybe 10. He had a terrible fever, and Eleanor had stayed up with him for 3 nights straight, bathing his forehead, whispering stories, refusing to rest until his fever broke. I remembered watching her from the doorway, her face etched with exhaustion, but also with a fierce, unwavering love. That was who she was, a fighter, a protector, a woman who loved with the force of a hurricane. And I had aimed my pathetic, selfish lie directly at the eye of that storm. A young nurse came in to check the IV drip. She moved with quiet efficiency, her eyes kind but professional. She offered me a small, sad smile. "It's good that you're here," she whispered. "Sometimes they can hear us." After she adjusted the drip, she picked up a clear plastic bag from the counter. It was one of those standard-issue patient property bags, sealed at the top. "These are her personal effects," she said, holding it out to me. "They were in her handbag when the paramedics brought her in. You should probably hold on to them." I took the bag from her, my fingers feeling numb and clumsy. The plastic was cool to the touch. The nurse gave Eleanor's chart one last look and then slipped out of the room, leaving us alone again in the beeping silence. I sank into the hard plastic visitor's chair, the bag resting in my lap. For a moment, I just stared at it. It felt like a sacred object, a final connection to the conscious woman who had existed just hours ago. Slowly, I opened the seal and tipped the contents onto my lap. Her wallet, a set of keys, a half-used tube of her favorite rose-colored lipstick, a crumpled grocery receipt, the mundane artifacts of a life that had been violently interrupted. Then I saw it. Tucked in a side pocket of her wallet was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a receipt. It was a pamphlet. I picked it up, my brows furrowing in confusion. The cover was a serene image of two clasped hands. The title read, "Healing the Hurt, a New Path for Your Marriage." It was a brochure from a local marriage counseling center, one of the best in the city. My heart began to pound, a sick, frantic rhythm that was a wild counterpoint to the steady beep of the monitor. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. Tucked inside was a small, stiff appointment card. On it, in neat blue ink, were our names, Samuel and Eleanor Miller. Below them was a date and a time. The date was today. The time was 4 p.m. My eyes darted from the card to the clock on the wall. It was almost 2 o'clock. She had made an appointment. For us. For this very afternoon. She hadn't given up. While I was packing my bag in secret, nursing my grievances, and manufacturing a lie to blow our world apart, she had been making a plan to save it. The lie I had told to justify my departure, the lie about another woman, was an act of ultimate cruelty. A final, devastating blow to a woman who was still, against all odds, reaching for my hand. The appointment card slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the floor, landing face up. It was a testament to her hope, and an indictment of my despair. And in that silent, sterile room, the full, crushing weight of what I had truly done finally fell upon me. The small, stiff card lay on the polished linoleum floor, a tiny white flag of a truce I had never known was being offered. Samuel and Eleanor Miller. Our names, linked together in neat blue ink, were a testament to a future she was trying to build, while I was taking a sledgehammer to our present. I stared at it, and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor in the other room seemed to change its tune. It was no longer just a measure of her life. It was a countdown, each beat a tick of a clock judging my actions. I had crafted a narrative of a loveless, toxic wasteland to justify my escape. I had told myself that our marriage was a corpse, and I was simply performing the mercy killing. But this card, this small, insignificant piece of paper, told a different story. It spoke of hope. It whispered that there was still a part of her, a brave and stubborn part, that believed the wasteland could bloom again. And I had salted the earth. My first instinct was primal, that of a criminal. I had to hide the evidence. My hand shot out, snatching the card from the floor just as the nurse who had given me the bag reappeared in the doorway. She smiled gently. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice a soft intrusion into my spiraling nightmare. I fumbled the card, shoving it deep into my pants pocket as if it were contraband. "Fine," I managed to choke out, my voice raspy. "Just tired." My heart was hammering against my ribs, a wild, panicked drumbeat. The card in my pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric, a physical manifestation of the secret now searing my conscience. It was heavier than a tombstone because it marked the grave of a hope I had killed without even knowing it was alive. "It's a lot to take in," she said, her kindness a form of torture. "Why don't you go get some coffee from the waiting room? We'll watch her." I could only nod. I stumbled out of the ICU, away from the beeping that had become the soundtrack to my guilt, and back into the purgatory of the waiting area. I didn't get coffee. I sank into one of the uncomfortable chairs, the same one I'd sat in hours earlier. But I was a different man. The man who had sat here before was guilty of a lie. This new man, the one with the appointment card in his pocket, was guilty of something far worse: the desecration of faith. I pulled the card out again, my hands trembling. I traced our names with my thumb. What had been going through her mind when she made this call? Had she been nervous? Hopeful? Had she pictured us sitting in a quiet office, finally unpacking the 20 years of baggage we'd been carrying? The thought of her, alone, making that call, trying to build a bridge to a man who was busy digging a trench, was an agony beyond measure. For the next few hours, I sat there, lost in a labyrinth of memory, re-examining the last few weeks, the last few months of our life together through this new, devastating lens. I had seen her quietness as indifference, her criticisms as attacks. But what if they were something else? What if her silence was the space she was trying to create for a conversation we never had? What if her criticisms were clumsy, desperate attempts to get me to see her, to engage with her, to fight for her instead of with her? The walls of my self-made prison of victimhood began to crumble, brick by brick, revealing a much uglier truth. I hadn't been a prisoner. I had been the warden. I was the one who had locked the doors, refusing any possibility of parole, because leaving was easier than trying. Trying is hard. It requires vulnerability, humility, and the kind of strength I hadn't possessed in years. Blowing things up is easy. It requires only a match. My lie about another woman had been my match, and with my son on his way, flying across the country toward this wreckage, I knew the trial was about to begin. I, the arsonist, would have to stand before the son who loved the home I had just burned to the ground and pretend to be a firefighter. The hypocrisy was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Night had fallen outside, but in the timeless, artificially lit world of the hospital, the hours just bled into one another. I had been there for nearly 10 hours, a marathon of anxiety and self-recrimination, when I saw him. Marcus appeared at the end of the long hallway, moving with a purpose and speed that seemed to part the sea of hospital staff and weary visitors. He was a stark contrast to his surroundings. Tall, dressed in a smart, dark travel coat, his face a younger, sharper, and far less weary version of my own. Seeing him was like looking at a ghost of a man I might have been, a man who had made different choices, who had built things instead of just letting them fall apart. As he drew closer, I saw the fear etched around his eyes, the tight set of his jaw. This was not a social visit. He was here as a son, summoned by disaster, and his entire demeanor was a question. What happened? He spotted me in the waiting area, and his pace quickened. I stood up, my legs stiff, my body aching with the fatigue that was bone deep. The moment I had been dreading was here. Dad. His voice was tight, strained. He dropped his carry-on bag by a chair, and his eyes immediately began scanning me, a rapid architect's assessment of a failing structure. "How is she?" I tried calling, but they wouldn't give me any information over the phone. "She's the same," I said, the words feeling inadequate, useless. "Stable," they keep saying. But it was bad, Marcus. Really bad. He nodded, absorbing the information, but his eyes weren't just on my face. They were on my cheek. I saw the exact moment he registered the burn. His gaze narrowed, a flicker of something dark and familiar passing through their depths. It was the same look he used to get as a teenager when he knew, instinctively, that one of us was lying about why a dish was broken or a bill was unpaid. "My God, Dad, what happened to your face?" The question was quiet, almost casual, but it landed with the force of an interrogation. Here it was, the first test, the first brick in the wall of lies I would now have to build between myself and my son. "It's nothing," I said, trying for a dismissive wave of my hand, but the gesture was clumsy, unconvincing. "Just this morning, before everything, I was making coffee, half asleep. The pot slipped. Just a stupid, clumsy accident. The lie tasted foul, a mix of ash and bile. It sounded pathetic even to my own ears. A man in his late 50s, suddenly too clumsy to pour a cup of coffee without scalding himself on the day his wife has a massive heart attack. It was a story full of holes, and my son, the architect, saw every single one of them. He didn't challenge it. He didn't call me a liar. He did something far worse. He just held my gaze, his own eyes filled with a profound and weary disappointment. He said nothing, but his silence was a screaming accusation. It said, "After all these years, you're still doing this, still lying, still hiding." In that moment, looking into my son's eyes and seeing not just his pain for his mother, but his contempt for his father, was a new kind of hell. It was a deeper, more personal circle of the damnation I was already in. "Right," he said finally, the single word dripping with disbelief. He turned away, breaking the excruciating eye contact, and paced over to the window, staring out at the city lights. "I want to see her. And I want to talk to her doctor. I want to know everything." "I already spoke to him," I offered, trying to regain some semblance of paternal authority, of being the man in charge of the situation. "Dr. Ramirez. He said the next 24 hours are critical." Marcus turned back to me, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. "And what did he say caused it?" "A heart attack like this doesn't just happen out of the blue. Was she under stress? Did something happen?" He was circling back, coming at the truth from a different angle, his questions precise and relentless. He was looking for a cause, an event, a trigger. He was looking for me. "He asked the same things," I said, my voice carefully neutral. I told him no. No unusual stress. Nothing out of the ordinary. Each lie I told him felt like I was betraying him more than I had betrayed his mother. I was robbing him of the truth of his own family's tragedy, painting a false narrative to protect myself. The love for my son warred with the terror of being exposed, and terror, that cold and selfish instinct, was winning. I could feel the distance between us widening with every sentence, becoming a tangible thing, a cold, dead space in the hospital waiting room. I had come here a husband and a father, But in the space of a few hours, I was becoming an island. My lies the vast, treacherous ocean that separated me from everyone else. And the worst part was, I was the one building the lighthouse, warning everyone to stay away. Marcus was gone for what felt like a lifetime. I remained in the waiting room, a solitary figure in a sea of anonymous grief. When he finally returned, the fear and panic in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, hard anger. It was the look of a man who had faced the worst and was now searching for someone to blame. He had spoken to Dr. Ramirez. He had stood by his mother's bedside, had seen her fragility, had listened to the mechanical breathing of the machines that were keeping her alive. He had been to the front lines of our war, and he had come back changed. He didn't sit down. He stood before me, his arms crossed, a judge staring down at a defendant he had already found guilty. The doctor told me, he began, his voice dangerously low, that these events, these massive sudden heart attacks, are almost always triggered by a severe emotional shock, a trauma. He asked me, just like he asked you, if she'd been under any unusual stress. He paused, letting the words hang in the air between us, heavy and sharp as shards of glass. I couldn't answer him, Dad, because I wasn't here, but you were. It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. He was laying the crime at my feet, daring me to deny it. My own son, my flesh and blood, was looking at me as if I were a stranger, a monster capable of the absolute worst. And the most terrible part was, he was right. I had no defense. The truth was a loaded gun, and I couldn't risk firing it. My silence was my only shield, but I could feel it cracking under the weight of his stare. Then, he delivered the killing blow. I don't get it, he said, his voice laced with a pained confusion that was somehow more cutting than his anger. I just don't get it. Mom called me last Tuesday. We talked for almost an hour. My head snapped up. An hour? Eleanor hated talking on the phone. She sounded better than she has in years, Marcus continued, his eyes unfocused, lost in the memory. She sounded hopeful. She said she was tired of all the fighting. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking, and she told me she wasn't ready to give up on you, on the marriage. She said she still loved you. He took a ragged breath, and for the first time, I saw tears glistening in his eyes. She said she was going to try a new approach, her words. She was really going to try. Every word was a nail being hammered into my coffin. The appointment card in my pocket, which already felt impossibly heavy, now seemed to be made of lead. She had told our son. She had made her hope known, had shared her plan. This wasn't just a secret wish. It was a declared intention. And I had met that declaration of peace with a declaration of war, armed with the cruelest lie I could conjure. Marcus looked at me, his face a mask of bewildered pain. So you'll have to forgive me, Dad, if I'm having a hard time understanding how we got from her being hopeful on Tuesday to her being in the ICU on Saturday morning. You're going to have to explain to me what the hell happened in those 4 days. I had no explanation. There was no story I could tell, no lie I could craft. That would bridge that gap. The chasm between her hope and her hospital bed was my doing, and my son knew it. I just stared at him, my mouth opening and closing like a fish, but no sound came out. The truth was lodged in my throat, a toxic, impassable stone. Seeing my utter failure to respond, his face hardened completely. The hurt vanished, replaced by a final, dismissive disgust. You know what? I can't do this right now, he said, shaking his head. I'm gonna go sit with her. You should probably go home. Get some rest. It was a clear and brutal dismissal. Go home. Not our home. Your home. He was exiling me, casting me out from the family circle of grief. He was the son, stepping up to protect his mother from the man who had hurt her. I had never felt so utterly alone. I watched him walk away, his back straight and unforgiving, and disappear back into the sterile quiet of the ICU. I was an outsider, a pariah. I stumbled away from the waiting room, not knowing where I was going, my feet carrying me down empty, silent corridors. I ended up in the hospital's deserted cafeteria. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. I sat at a small empty table under the harsh fluorescent lights and pulled Eleanor's wallet from my coat pocket. My hand shook as I opened it again. I needed to see the appointment card one more time to confirm that this nightmare was real. As I fumbled with the worn leather, a small folded piece of paper I hadn't noticed before slipped out from behind her driver's license and fluttered onto the table. It wasn't the card. It was a receipt. My fingers, clumsy and numb, unfolded it. It was from a department store downtown, a place I knew she liked. The date was from 2 days ago. My eyes scanned the itemized list, expecting to see a blouse, a new pair of shoes, something for herself. But there was only one item listed. Cambridge Collection men's dress shirt. Color, steel blue. Size, L. My size. My favorite color. My mind, slow and thick with exhaustion and grief, struggled to make sense of it. A shirt? Why would she buy me a shirt? We hadn't exchanged gifts in years. Then my eyes fell upon a calendar hanging on the cafeteria wall, a cheap promotional thing from a pharmaceutical company. My gaze drifted over the dates for the coming week, and then it stopped. It stopped on a date circled in red marker by some anonymous hospital employee. Thursday. And the word written beside it was anniversary. Our 23rd wedding anniversary. I had forgotten. In the middle of everything, in the heart of our Cold War, I had completely and utterly forgotten. But she hadn't. This small, simple receipt was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It wasn't a grand, hopeful gesture like the therapy appointment. It was something quieter, deeper. It was a testament to the stubborn, persistent rituals of love. It was proof that beneath the layers of bitterness and anger, there was a woman who was still my wife, a woman who still intended to honor the day we had made our vows. She was buying a shirt for a man she was planning to go to counseling with, for an anniversary he had forgotten. The receipt slipped from my grasp. The flimsy piece of paper held the entire weight of my failure as a husband and as a man. The carefully constructed image of my wife as a bitter, vengeful shrew, the narrative that had justified my lie, was obliterated. I had not been running from a monster. I had been running from a woman who, in her own wounded way, was still trying to love me. A sob, raw and ugly, tore its way from my chest. I buried my face in my hands, the full, crushing weight of my monstrous act finally breaking me. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the cafeteria my only companion. Then, a new feeling began to crystallize through the fog of my grief. It was not resignation. It was resolve. I couldn't undo what I had done. I couldn't take back the lie or heal her heart with an apology. But I could stop lying. The secret was a poison, and it was killing me as surely as it had almost killed her. It was infecting my son, turning him against me. I couldn't carry it anymore. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. A terrifying clarity washed over me. I knew what I had to do. With the receipt clutched in my fist, I started walking, not towards the exit, but back towards the ICU, back towards my son, my steps firm and resolute. The time for hiding was over. The walk back to the ICU was the longest of my life. Each step was a deliberate, conscious act, a march away from the shadows of deceit and toward a brutal, unforgiving light. The crumpled receipt in my fist was a relic, a sacred text that had given me this newfound, terrifying purpose. The appointment card in my pocket was its companion testament. Together, they formed the gospel of a truth I had been blind to, the story of a woman who had been fighting for our marriage while I had been plotting its demise. I was no longer just a man running from his past. I was a penitent walking toward his judgment. I didn't know what the outcome would be. A screaming match? A punch from my son? A final, irrevocable severing of the last family tie I had? I found that I didn't care. The agony of the secret was greater than any punishment the truth could bring. To continue lying now would be the ultimate desecration of Eleanor's hope, and I could not bear that. I would not bear that. I saw him as I rounded the corner into the cardiac wing. Marcus was standing outside the ICU's glass doors, his back to me, speaking in low, hushed tones on his cell phone. He was likely updating a relative, his sister perhaps, on Eleanor's condition. He looked exhausted, his broad shoulders slumped, the smart travel coat now looking rumpled and out of place. He was just a boy, I thought, a boy forced to carry the weight of his parents' failures. My resolve wavered for a heartbeat. Did I have the right to add to his burden? To shatter his world with a confession that would obliterate any lingering image he had of his father as a decent man? It was the final, desperate plea of my own cowardice, the instinct for self-preservation making its last stand. I squeezed the receipt in my hand, the sharp corners of the paper digging into my palm. The small pain was an anchor. This wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't about preserving my dignity, what little I had left. This was about honoring the truth of the woman lying in that bed, even if it meant my own destruction. I took a deep breath, preparing to call out his name, to set the avalanche in motion. But the words never left my lips. At that exact moment, a series of sharp, frantic beeps erupted from down the hall, a sound far more urgent and piercing than the steady rhythm of the monitors. The glass doors to the ICU burst open, and Dr. Ramirez rushed out, a nurse at his heels, their faces tight with adrenaline. "We need a crash cart in 304 now," the doctor commanded, his voice sharp, cutting through the hospital's quiet hum. They raced past Marcus and me, their urgency a palpable force. Then, a calm, disembodied female voice echoed from the overhead speakers, a chilling counterpoint to the rising panic. Code Blue, Cardiac ICU. Code Blue, Cardiac ICU, Room 304. Room 304. Eleanor's room. The world seemed to drop out from under me. Marcus whipped around, his phone call forgotten, his face instantly draining of all color. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that shared glance, our personal war was annihilated. There was no father and son, no accuser and accused. There were only two men, terrified of losing the woman who was the center of their universe. The low, rumbling alarm from her room was now a continuous, soul-shaking drone. We both broke into a run, rushing to the large window of her room, our hearts pounding in a syncopated rhythm of terror. We were too late. A swarm of blue-scrubbed figures was already flooding the room, their movements a blur of controlled chaos. They surrounded her bed, blocking our view, their bodies forming a living wall between us and her. We could see glimpses, a crash cart being rolled into place, a nurse tearing open a sterile package, another preparing a syringe. The scene was a frantic, silent movie of desperation, the only sound the muffled shouts of doctors and the relentless, deafening alarm. Eleanor was crashing. The heart I had broken with a lie was now, finally, giving out. And all I could do was stand on the other side of the glass and watch, a helpless, horrified spectator to the final act of a tragedy I had written myself. Time seemed to warp and stretch in the hallway outside room 304. Seconds became minutes, minutes an eternity, all measured by the horrible, continuous drone of the alarm. Marcus and I were frozen, two statues of dread pressed against the cold, unfeeling glass of the window. Our own bitter conflict, which had seemed so monumental just moments before, was now a petty squabble in the face of this overwhelming elemental terror. All that mattered was the desperate battle for life happening just a few feet away. We were so close, yet we might as well have been on the moon. The glass was a barrier, not just to the room, but to any hope of intervention, of taking back what had been done, of screaming an apology into the hurricane. I could feel the vibrations of the activity inside through the soles of my shoes, of frantic energy that pulsed through the very floor of the hospital. My mind, unable to process the chaos in front of me, began to splinter. I was bargaining, pleading with the God I had ignored for 20 years, making the kind of desperate foxhole promises a man makes when he is facing his own utter damnation. Let her live. Just let her live, and I'll tell the truth. I'll tell everyone. I'll spend the rest of my life making it right. Just don't let this be the end. Don't let my lie be the last word. The burn on my face, my mark of Cain, throbbed with a fiery intensity, a constant reminder of my sin. It was a beacon of my guilt, and in my fevered state, I imagined the doctors inside could see it through the glass, that they knew who was responsible for the still figure on the bed. I was no longer a husband. I was a murderer, waiting for the verdict on whether my victim would survive the assault. Through the gaps in the shifting bodies of the medical team, I saw them bring out the defibrillator paddles. The sight sent a jolt of pure, undiluted horror through me. The metallic gleam of the paddles, the methodical way a nurse applied gel to them, the doctor's sharp command, charging. It was the final terrible symbol of everything that had gone wrong. They were trying to shock her heart back into rhythm, the very heart that I had shocked with my cruelty. The parallel was so precise, so hideously perfect, it felt like a deliberate act of cosmic judgment. They were trying to fix with electricity what I had broken with a lie. In that instant, something inside me shattered. The carefully constructed walls I had built to contain my guilt, to manage my secret, were obliterated. The secret was too big, too toxic. It was a radioactive core melting down inside me, and it was about to breach containment. As the doctor held the paddles aloft, ready to deliver the charge, the truth finally tore its way out of me. It wasn't a decision. It was an expulsion, a violent, involuntary purge of the poison I could no longer hold. I turned to Marcus, my vision blurred by tears I didn't know I was crying. The words came out in a ragged, desperate gasp, stumbling over each other in their frantic escape. It was me, I choked out, my voice a broken thing. Marcus, it's my fault. All of this, it's my fault. Marcus tore his eyes away from the window, his face a canvas of confusion and fear. Dad, what are you talking about? Not now. No, you have to listen, I insisted, grabbing his arm, my grip frantic. I needed him to know. I needed someone to know before it was too late. There's no other woman. I made her up. I lied. The confession, now spoken aloud, seemed to suck all the air from the hallway. I wanted to leave. I wanted to hurt her enough so she would hate me, so it would be a clean break. I was a coward. We fought this morning. She was so angry, so hurt, and she threw the coffee at me. That's this, I said, pointing a trembling finger to the burn on my cheek. This is from her. Because of what I said. I pushed her to it. I broke her heart, and she collapsed. Oh God, son, I did this. I did this to her. The full, ugly truth was finally out, laid bare in the sterile, unforgiving light of the hospital corridor. Marcus stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The suspicion in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, gut-wrenching horror as he processed the sheer, calculated cruelty of my actions. He understood now. It wasn't just a fight. It was an execution. But there was no time for his rage, no space for his condemnation. At that exact moment, the doctor in the room shouted, "Clear!" And we both snapped our heads back to the window just in time to see it. Through a gap in the medical team, we saw Eleanor's body, a body I knew as well as my own, arch violently off the bed, a grotesque, involuntary spasm as the electricity surged through her. Her life, her fate, was captured in that single, terrible, silent convulsion. And the monstrous truth of my confession hung in the air between her son and me, a second, invisible charge, shocking the last remnants of our family to ashes. The violent arch of Eleanor's body as the electricity surged through her was burned into my retinas. In the terrible, ringing silence that followed the shock, the world seemed to hold its breath. Marcus and I stood frozen, our personal drama suspended, our gazes locked on the scene behind the glass. Inside the room, the doctors and nurses were a flurry of focused motion, their eyes fixed on the monitor above Eleanor's bed. The jagged, chaotic line that had represented her heart's fatal arrhythmia was gone. For a horrifying second, the line was flat. A straight, green, unmoving line of absolute finality. My own heart stopped. This was it. The end. The consequence of my lie, rendered in a single unwavering electronic beam. A strangled sob escaped my lips, a sound of pure, primal despair. But then, a flicker. A single, hopeful blip. And another. And then another, falling into a slow, steady, rhythmic beat. Beep, beep, beep. The straight line was gone, replaced by the familiar, life-affirming peaks and valleys of a stable heartbeat. The frantic, piercing alarm was silenced, and the only sound was that quiet, life-giving pulse. The tension in the room behind the glass broke. Shoulders slumped in relief. A nurse wiped her brow. The immediate crisis had passed. They had brought her back from the very edge of the abyss. A wave of relief so profound it buckled. My knees washed over me. I sagged against the wall, my legs trembling, my body slick with a cold sweat. She was alive. My lie had not been a death sentence. It was a miracle, a reprieve, a second chance I did not deserve. I looked at Marcus, wanting to share in this fragile, momentous victory. But the relief on my son's face was already gone, replaced by the cold, hard memory of the words I had spoken just moments before. The external storm had passed, leaving us in its quiet, devastating wake, stranded together in the wreckage of my confession. The truth was out, raw and festering in the sterile air between us. The shared terror that had momentarily united us had evaporated, and the chasm between us was now wider and deeper than ever. Dr. Ramirez came out of the room, pulling the surgical mask from his face. He looked 10 years older than he had this morning, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "We got her back," he said, his voice low and tired. "Her heart is in a stable rhythm. For now. She's incredibly weak, but she's a fighter." He looked from me to Marcus and back again. "She needs absolute rest. No stress, no shocks. Do you understand?" He was looking at me when he said it, his gaze pointed and heavy. He knew. He didn't know the details, but he knew enough. He gave us a final, weary nod and disappeared down the hall to write his reports. The moment he was gone, the silence between me and Marcus became immense, a crushing weight. He turned to me, and any hope I had that the shared trauma of the last few minutes might have softened him was instantly annihilated. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of heat, which made it all the more terrifying. It was the voice of a judge delivering a final, unappealable sentence. "So let me make sure I have the story straight," he began, his words precise and methodical, like an architect reviewing the blueprint of a catastrophe. "While my mother was on the phone with me, telling me that she still loved you, that she wasn't ready to give up on you, you were in your bedroom, packing a bag to leave her." He paused, his eyes boring into me, daring me to deny it. I couldn't. I could only stand there, a prisoner in the dock. "And while she was at a department store, buying you a shirt for your anniversary, an anniversary you didn't even remember, you were at home, rehearsing the cruelest, most destructive lie you could possibly invent. Not just that you were leaving, but that you were leaving her for someone else, for a woman who doesn't even exist." His voice dropped to a whisper, a sound more menacing than any shout. "And you did all of this. You constructed this whole vicious fiction to shatter her, to make sure you hurt her so badly that she would never recover. Am I missing any of the details, Dad?" A sob caught in my throat. "Marcus." Quote. "Don't," he snapped, holding up a hand. The mask of calm finally cracked, revealing the raging inferno of pain beneath. "Don't you dare say you're sorry. Don't you dare try to explain. We almost just lost her. I almost just lost my mother because you are a coward, because you are so profoundly, pathologically selfish that you would rather burn her world to the ground than have one honest, difficult conversation." He took a step closer, and for the first time in his adult life, I saw a flicker of genuine hatred for me in his eyes. "You are not the victim here. You are not the man who was trapped. You were the one holding the key the entire time, and you chose to set the house on fire instead." He took a deep, shuddering breath, composing himself, putting the mask of cold fury back in place. "Get out," he said, the two words landing like punches. "I want you to leave this hospital. Now. I don't want you anywhere near her. I don't want you anywhere near me. I will take care of her. I will make the decisions. And if she wakes up and asks for you, I will be the one who decides if she ever has to see your face again. Now go. Get out of my sight." It was a final, absolute banishment. There was no appeal, no room for negotiation. My confession had not brought me relief. It had brought me justice. I had been judged by my son, and the sentence was exile. I looked past him, through the glass, at the still form of my wife, the steady beep of the monitor the only sound connecting her to this world. And I looked at my son, his face set like stone, a stranger who now stood as a guardian at the gate of my own life. I had lost everything. It was all gone. With a final, crushing sense of defeat, I turned my back on the two of them. I didn't say another word. I just walked away. Down the sterile corridor, into the waiting elevator, through the hushed lobby, and out the automatic doors into the cool night air. I stood on the pavement under the lonely orange glow of a streetlight, the sounds of the city a distant hum. I had no home to go to. I had no family to call. I was a ghost, haunting the edges of a life I had just finished destroying. I had nothing left to lose. The question that echoed in the profound and terrifying emptiness was no longer how I could fix this, but what a man becomes after he has been reduced to absolute zero. The automatic doors of the hospital slid shut behind me, severing the last connection to the life I had known. The cool night air was no longer a promise of freedom. It was the chilling breath of the void. I stood on the pavement, a man hollowed out, the architecture of my identity, husband, father, reduced to rubble. My son's words, "Get out," echoed in my skull, a final, definitive judgment. I had been cast out, and in the profound emptiness that followed, a terrifying question began to form. What do you do on the first day of the rest of your life, when you've already destroyed it? I had no answer. I started walking, with no destination in mind, my feet carrying me through the sleeping city. Each streetlight I passed felt like a spotlight, exposing me, a man whose sins were now as plain to see as the burn on his face. The next few days bled into a gray, featureless fog of despair. I holed up in that same cheap motel room, but it was no longer a temporary refuge. It was a cell. The television droned on, unwatched. Food was a tasteless necessity. Sleep was a shallow, restless state, populated by nightmares of beeping monitors and my son's accusing eyes. The silence was the worst part. For 20 years, my life had been defined by the noise of my marriage, the arguments, the criticisms, the slammed doors, the resentful silences that were somehow louder than any shout. Now, there was nothing. Just the low hum of the mini-fridge and the frantic circular thoughts of a man dissecting his own moral autopsy. I was a ghost, haunting the wreckage of my own making. My exile was absolute. Once a day, my courage would muster itself into a pathetic little ball, and I would call the hospital's main desk. "I'm calling for an update on Eleanor Miller," I'd say, my voice a stranger's. The response was always the same polite, professional stonewall. "I'm sorry, sir. We can only give information to immediate family." The words were a fresh stab of the knife every time. I was no longer immediate family. I had been surgically removed from the body of my own life. I had no rights, no access, no claim. I was nothing to her now. In my isolation, memories ambushed me. But strangely, it wasn't the bad times that haunted me most. It was the good. I'd be staring at a crack in the ceiling, and suddenly I'd remember the sound of Eleanor's laugh, a genuine, unrestrained peal of joy from 20 years ago, when we were painting the nursery for Marcus. I'd remember the taste of the lemon pound cake she used to make, the determined look on her face when she was fixing the leaky faucet I had given up on. These memories were torture, ghosts of a love I had allowed to starve to death. I had told myself a story of a bitter, loveless marriage to justify my actions, but my own mind was now presenting evidence to the contrary, proving me not just a coward, but a fool. After what felt like a lifetime, but was probably only a week, I knew I couldn't continue to exist in that room. I was either going to rot, or I was going to suffocate. One evening, driven by a desperation I couldn't name, I found myself looking up local support groups. Not for anything specific, just a place to go. I found a listing for a men's group that met in the basement of a nearby church. The description was vague. A place for men to share their struggles and find a better path. It sounded like a cliché, but it was somewhere to be. I went, my heart hammering with a new kind of anxiety. I sat in the back of a circle of folding chairs, a collection of men of all ages and backgrounds, their faces etched with their own private wars. I listened as they spoke of divorce, of addiction, of grief, of failures as fathers and husbands. Their stories were all different, but their theme was the same. They were all men who had, in one way or another, hit rock bottom. I didn't speak. I couldn't. But for the first time since I had walked out of that hospital, I didn't feel entirely alone. I was a man in exile, but I had found a small, dimly lit island populated by other castaways. It wasn't home, but it was a start. Weeks turned into a month. The raw, open wound of my exile began to scar over, a dull, permanent ache replacing the sharp agony. I found a new rhythm, a monastic, penitent routine that was as monotonous as it was necessary. I worked long hours at the auto garage, losing myself in the familiar mechanics of engines, the grease and oil a welcome grit to focus on. I rented a small, furnished room above a laundromat, a place with no memories and no ghosts. The highlight of my week, if it could be called that, was the Thursday night men's group meeting in the church basement. I went every week without fail, a pilgrimage to the only place I felt I could breathe. I listened to other men's stories of failure and regret, and in their shared brokenness, I felt a flicker of humanity in myself. One rainy Thursday, after a month of silent attendance, I finally spoke. The words came out haltingly at first, a confession to the linoleum floor. But then, I looked up and saw the faces of the other men, the old mechanic with the sad eyes, the young father fighting for custody, the quiet man who had lost his business. And I saw no judgment. I saw only a weary recognition. And so, I told them everything. I spoke of the 20 years of quiet resentment, of my cowardice, of the lie I had invented about another woman. I told them about the coffee, the burn, the heart attack. I told them about the therapy appointment she had made and the anniversary shirt she had bought. I laid the full, unvarnished ugliness of my story at their feet. When I finished, the silence in the room was not one of condemnation, but of profound, shared sorrow. No one offered cheap advice or easy absolution. The old mechanic simply nodded and said, "It takes a man to tell a truth like that." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was an acknowledgement, and it was enough. My connection to the life I had lost was tenuous, a thread I was terrified of breaking. I couldn't bring myself to call the hospital again, to hear that I was not family. So sometimes, on my way home from work, I would make a detour. I would drive to the physical rehabilitation center on the other side of town, the place I imagined she would be. I never got out of my truck. I would just park across the street, watching the main entrance from a distance, feeling like a spy in my own life. It was a pathetic ritual, but it was all I had. One afternoon, I saw him. Marcus was walking out the main doors, and the sight of him sent a pang of grief and longing through me so sharp it made me gasp. He looked tired, but he was walking with the purpose, his shoulders not as slumped as they had been in the hospital. He was taking care of her. He was being the man I should have been. The immediate crisis was over. That was all I needed to know. I started the engine and drove away before he could see me. The text message arrived 2 months after the day I had left. I was sitting in my room, the drone of the washing machines below a familiar lullaby, when my phone buzzed. An unknown number. My heart leaped into my throat. With trembling hands, I opened it. It was from Marcus. The words were brief, cold, and factual, stripped of any emotion. She was discharged from rehab today. She is strong enough now. I told her everything. The lie, the shirt, all of it. She is staying with me for the foreseeable future. She does not want to see you or speak to you. I read the message 5 times, each word a separate blow. She knows everything. She doesn't want to see you. It was the verdict I had been expecting, the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. A profound wave of sorrow washed over me, but underneath it, there was something else. A strange, quiet sense of release. The secret was fully out. The waiting, the wondering, the torturous uncertainty. It was over. The worst had happened, and I was still here, still breathing. That night, for the first time in months, I knew what I had to do. Forcing contact, begging for a forgiveness I hadn't earned, would be just another act of selfishness. If I had any love left for her at all, it had to be a love that respected her peace, even if that peace required my permanent absence. I sat down at the small, wobbly desk in my room with a piece of paper and a pen. I began to write a letter. It took me all night. I wrote and rewrote, crumpling up dozens of false starts. I wasn't writing to ask for anything. I was writing to give something back, the truth from my perspective, and the validation she deserved. I wrote about my fear, my weakness, my profound regret. I acknowledged her hope, the appointment card, the shirt, and I told her that my greatest shame was that I had been so lost in my own misery. I had failed to see her light. I took full, unvarnished responsibility for every selfish decision, for the lie, for the pain I had caused. I ended the letter by telling her I would honor her wishes. I would not call. I would not visit. I would disappear from her life, if that is what she needed to heal. My only prayer, I wrote, was that she could one day find the happiness that I had so carelessly destroyed. The next morning, I put the letter in a clean white envelope, addressed it simply to Eleanor, and drove to my son's apartment building. I didn't try to go up. I left it with the concierge, a final, unconditional surrender. As I walked away, I felt no lighter, but I felt a sense of rightness. It was the first honest, unselfish thing I had done in years. A year is a long time. It's long enough for seasons to turn, for wounds to close, for a man to learn the geography of a new life. 1 year after I left that letter at my son's apartment, I was a different man. I still lived in the same small room above the laundromat. I still worked at the same garage, my hands still stained with the familiar grease and oil. But the landscape inside me had changed. The raging forest fire of my guilt and shame had burned itself out, and in its place, something new and quiet had begun to grow. I had kept my promise. I never called, never wrote again, never drove by their homes. I had performed the final, most difficult act of love. I had let them go completely. My life was simple, and in its simplicity, I found a strange kind of peace. My days were for work. My nights were for reading. And my Thursday evenings were for the men in the church basement, where I had learned that the only way to carry a heavy past is to share the load. I had accepted my solitude. I had made peace with the fact that my story was not one of redemption, but of consequence. I had caused a wound so deep that it might never fully heal, and my punishment was not a cell of iron bars, but a life lived with the full knowledge of my own capacity for destruction. I was a man who had been given a second chance not to reclaim what he had lost, but to build something better in the ruins. I had learned to respect the man in the mirror again, not because he was perfect, but because he was honest. The angry red burn on my cheek had faded into a pale silvery scar, a permanent reminder of the morning I had set my world on fire. It no longer throbbed with shame. It was just a part of my story, a map of where I had been. It was a Sunday in late spring, a year and a half since the day of the heart attack. The air was warm and smelled of freshly cut grass. I was in a small park near my apartment, sitting on a bench, reading a worn paperback. It was a quiet, peaceful afternoon. Children were laughing on a nearby playground, and an old couple was walking hand in hand down a shaded path. I felt a pang of envy, but it was a gentle, familiar ache now, not a stabbing pain. I was content in my quiet corner of the world. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I rarely got texts, and I glanced at it, expecting it to be a message from my boss about a shift change. But the number was not one I recognized. My heart gave a small, traitorous leap. For a year, I had told myself I expected nothing, hoped for nothing. But in that single buzzing moment, I realized I had been lying to myself. A part of me had always been waiting. With a hand that was not quite steady, I opened the message. My breath caught in my chest. The sender was simply identified by the phone number, but I knew who it was. The message was just one line, 2 sentences, but they held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. It read, Samuel. The gardenias you planted by the back porch are blooming. I thought you would like to know. I read it once, twice, 10 times. It was from Eleanor. The first direct contact. The first words from her to me in 18 months. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a declaration of forgiveness or a plea for my return. It was something far more complex and far more beautiful. It was an acknowledgement of a shared past, the gardenias you planted. It was a message from the present. They are blooming. It was a quiet, graceful gesture that spanned the chasm of silence between us. The gardenias had been her favorite. I had planted them for her on our 10th anniversary, a rare moment of peace in our increasingly turbulent life. That she was there, at the house, tending to them. That she thought to tell me of them. It was a message of life, of continuity, of healing. It was not a door being thrown open, but it was the sound of a lock, rusted shut for what felt like an eternity, finally, gently, being turned. A slow smile spread across my face. It was not the triumphant grin of a man who had won his prize, but the quiet, peaceful smile of a man who had been given a gift he never expected. A gift of grace. I didn't reply. Not yet. The message was too important to be met with a hasty response. It was something to be savored, to be understood. I put the phone back in my pocket and looked up. I saw the green of the trees, the blue of the sky, the faces of the people walking by. The world seemed more vibrant, more real than it had in a very long time. The future I had seen as a barren wasteland now seemed like a plot of land, waiting. It might never be the lush, beautiful garden it once was, but it was not nothing. It was a place where things could still grow. The scar on my face was a reminder of the fire, of the poison, of the pain. But the message in my pocket, the image of those blooming white flowers, was a reminder that even after the most brutal of winters, spring can, and eventually does, arrive.